Welcome back to another episode of the Success Times Happiness podcast. I'm your host, Richard Thompson, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jim Lagopoulos, a globally respected neuropsychologist and mental health thought leader whose work spans brain imaging, precision psychiatry, and groundbreaking treatments that are reshaping the future of mental health care, especially here on the Sunshine Coast. Our conversation dives deep into why traditional approaches are failing us, what the science now reveals, and how new interventions could change millions of lives. Whether you're supporting someone you love or navigating your own mental well-being, this episode is for you. All right, let's get into it. Dr. Jim Lagopoulos, thank you so much for coming onto the show, mate.
Richard, thanks very much for the invite.
Leading from that, it seems like this is a escalating, the mental health or the edge of a mental health epidemic. Why is it that the way we treat this is, in your mind, an afterthought, or instead of a public health crisis? And why are we tackling something like this in the same way that we always have, but it hasn't actually resolved itself?
The biggest problem when it comes to mental health in both treating and also the diagnosis comes back to one fundamental point, and that is everything that we do in the mental health space at the moment is based on subjective measures of assessment. And that is to say that psychiatrists and doctors rely on what the patient is feeling, mood and behaviour on that particular day. Now, psychiatry is the only medical discipline that relies almost entirely on subjective measures of mood and behaviour. Now, depending on what someone says, and also depending on the interpretation, and it's all open for interpretation by the clinician, they're going to get it wrong. So there are no objective tests for any of the mental health conditions that we diagnose and treat. Now, this is a real problem because if you don't have objective measures that actually go back to a fundamental mechanism, then you can't really tailor treatments that go to the root cause of what's causing the symptoms. And that's what we've got. We've got medicines and interventions and treatments in psychiatry that, for the most part, at best, are less than 30% effective. Now, that doesn't happen in any other medical discipline. And the main problem with that comes down to the subjectivity of both the diagnosis and the treatment options that we've got.
Jim, you've spent decades studying the brain and its connection with mental health. Tell us how you first became convinced that the link between the two.
As a non-psychiatrist, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a neurophysiologist. As a non-psychiatrist, I look at the brain in a very different way. So I look at objective measures of brain change and then look at how those brain changes may cause symptoms.
Subjective symptoms.
Yeah, that causes symptoms. And so rather than chasing the symptoms and rather than chasing and trying to reverse the symptoms or treat the symptoms, our line of work and our clinic specifically seeks to do is to treat the underlying brain change. So we use sophisticated brain imaging. So brain imaging is at the heart of the work that we do. And I guess that is what has, in more recent times, created, if you like, this new area which we call precision psychiatry. So understanding changes in brain connectivity, brain structure. There's a lot of these brain changes and where they map onto the brain, and being able to treat those changes and then looking at the improvements in mood and behaviour is essentially what we do. To kind of put it into concrete terms, the mainstay treatment for any psychiatric condition, pretty much all psychiatric conditions, the treatments are medications that are based on serotonin, right? They're serotonergic agents. We often hear of them in the news, or you'll read about SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And the basis of which these work is that they increase or they preserve the serotonin level in the synaptic cleft. Now, those medications, I should say, work for less than 30% of people that take them. And for those that don't work, the treatment options are to take another one, a different class of the same drug.
When you say work, what does that mean?
To have a discernible alleviation of your symptoms. So if someone has
However long for?
any improvement in your symptoms, actually, and for the majority of people, more than 70% of people, they don't get improvements in their symptoms. No improvements in their symptoms. And if you look at the randomized control trials, the blinded trials, the gold standard trials, what they show is that the current mainstay treatment work in about 25 or 26% of instances, and placebo, those that get, the sugar pill, they work in about 25% of instances. So the mainstay treatment for depression, anxiety, PTSD, many of these mental health conditions is about 1 or 2% better than taking nothing at all. Now, having said that, if you are one of the lucky ones that actually derive improvement from these medications, that is fantastic and it's life-changing. You take the medication and you keep taking it because it'll keep you well, and that's what you've got to do. But if you're one of these unfortunate people that don't get a bounce, if you like, from these medications, it can be a long and torturous road to try to find, a medicine or a treatment that works. So, for example, if the first medication fails, the chance of you deriving a benefit from the second serotonin medication is about 18%. It's even lower. Right. And then the current treatment model is that if you fail your second, we've got to give you a third medicine. And the chance of the third medicine is about 9%. And if you fail the third medication, the model is that you've got to receive a fourth. And the fourth medicine, the chance of the fourth medicine working is almost zero. It's almost zero. So the traditional medications that we've got don't work. And so it beggars the question, why do we have these medicines that really don't work? It beggars belief.
Is it a biological reason why the uptake is so small in terms of those medicines?
The answer to the question, actually, you've got to go back about 20 years. And about 20 or 30 years ago, there was a hypothesis that was posed. And the hypothesis essentially said that depression or mental health symptoms were predicated on a low serotonin level. Now, all these medicines were developed on the basis of that hypothesis that in our brains, when we've got mental health challenges, that our serotonin levels are low. Now, if you fast forward 30 years, in 2017, that serotonin hypothesis of mental health or mental ill health was debunked. We don't have low serotonin in our brains. And it's not surprising that these medications, whose job is to increase or preserve serotonin levels, don't work very well because
the link is shady at best.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it really corresponds, that 30% that derive an improvement is about right because we expect, maybe about 25 or 30% might have a low serotonin, and it's for those people that it works. But for the vast majority of people who are struggling with their mental ill health,
it's got nothing to do with the serotonin levels.
Absolutely.
So the prescription drugs that don't quote unquote work for the 70%, their serotonin levels are preserved and increased, but the subjective symptom hasn't alleviated.
Yeah, correct. Right. The other thing to say, and I don't want to spend our time together, Richard, demonising these drugs because, as I said, for those people that they work for, they are life changing and they are literally life saving medicines. But the reality is that these medications also come with very significant side effects. So if you're one of the unfortunate ones where they don't work and you have to trial these medicines, then wait 6 to 8 weeks to see if they're going to work, and then you trial the next one and wait another 6 to 8 weeks, it's a long process. Now, throughout that process, the side effects are quite significant. And even when they do work, if you're one of the lucky ones, they do come with very significant side effects as well.
I guess in my sporting background, and certainly here at work, I'm very data-driven. I'm very I want to see the link. I want to see what can be measured, can be improved, is my philosophy. why has there been for so long in the psychology, psychiatry space, has there not been a direct link to brain scans to see what the brain is actually doing? Because I would have thought that would be a fairly important.
I think it's historical. I mean, if you go back to the Freudian days and, the way that those models and the way that people thought that mental ill health developed is just not right. Now, why don't we use brain scans and blood tests and, objective markers? Well, we're starting to do that now, but traditionally we haven't done that because mental ill health is not one of those. You don't see changes in brain function and brain structure on traditional brain imaging. And so in the early days of MRI, for example, which was revolutionary, so you could see a brain tumour like nothing ever before. It was non-invasive, you got great resolution. But of course, mental ill health is not a brain tumour. Mental ill health revolves around changes in brain connectivity and the way that different parts of the brain will speak to each other and how information is transferred across white matter tracts and grey matter areas of the brain. And traditionally, or in times gone past, you couldn't image those things. But if you fast forward 20 years or so since, the advent or since MRI first hit our shores, there are new sophisticated modalities which allow us to look at all of those measures: brain connectivity, white matter tractography, which are the connections between different parts of the brain. And now we're actually starting to see those areas. And if I could be somewhat controversial and say that one of the reasons why we are moving away from traditional models of psychiatry and looking into new treatment interventions and drugs is based on some of the data that we've received with these new MRI modalities, being able to spatially localize brain changes, understanding the mechanisms that drive these changes. So number one, being able to see these changes in the brain, and it's only in the last 5 to 10 years that we really have got a grasp of these things. And number two, being able to localize and understand the mechanism. And from that data or from that information, we've been able to develop treatments that now have got success rates, 3, 4, 5 times higher than what the mainstay treatments were in the past.
Has the peer-reviewed articles and research in the medical community jumped on board with this sort of last 5 to 10 years? Sounds like it's a combination of technology improving to be able to scan and measure, and then obviously the relevant parts of the medical industry jumping on and leaning into this development.
Not fast enough. Not fast enough, Richard. So let me give you an example of ketamine, for example. Ketamine, in my opinion, and in other people's opinion as well, is one of the most significant advances in psychiatry in the last 100 years. So we talk about remission rates when people are treated with this medicine. We talk about remission rates of upwards of 80%. When the previous the previous models were down around the 20%. Now, I first published, and I wasn't the first, other people have done this. We first published, and people knew about the antidepressant properties of ketamine in the early 2000s. Now, if you fast forward 25 years to 2025, I can tell you that whilst ketamine now is gaining some traction in the treatment of mental health conditions, it's not mainstay treatment. There are clinics, absolutely, but it's not a model of care that is run out of hospitals, for example. And that is to say, the translation of very strong evidence takes a long time. And in ketamine's case, it's 25 years and we still don't use it as we should in, for example, public hospitals.
What's the pushback?
I've had discussions with local area health services. Now, this is interstate. It's a different local area health service where I wanted to run a clinical trial in an emergency department. Now, in the emergency departments, and people may not know this, is that almost 50%, and in some instances more than 50% of presentations in an emergency department are mental health related. Some of those are at the very severe end of the spectrum. Now, we know ketamine works very, very quickly, can work in a matter of hours, whereas the traditional medications can take up to 8 weeks. Now, these medicines, ketamine, can work within a couple of hours and can get someone stabilised and feeling and thinking better within a couple of hours. Now, you would think within the confines of a big, major public hospital in an emergency department, which is full of doctors, that we could give a medicine like ketamine to help someone who may be in absolute crisis, but we don't do it even today. And when I speak to the powers that be and I say, well, look, I'd like to run a trial in your emergency department about the efficacy of ketamine for someone who is at heightened risk for suicide, some of the responses I've got are just mind-boggling. They would say to me, but Jim, you don't expect us to give ketamine to this patient. And I scratch my head and I say, yes, of course that's what I expect. This is a hospital. We give ketamine to people in an anaesthetic in an anaesthetic context every single day of the year. Thousands of doses every year. In a medical context, in a medical framework, ketamine is incredibly safe. Doctors know how to use ketamine. It's a very safe medicine. We've used it for, 50, 60, 80 years. So the translation of some of the most promising discoveries takes a very, very long time for them to be translated into clinical, into a clinical service, and that's very, very disappointing. And if you look at the 20 years from 2001, for example, when we first published the antidepressant properties of ketamine, could have saved thousands of lives in that time.
Through your journey, has anything changed in terms of your perspective or your understanding of the root cause of mental health issues? Is it all biology, or are we not appreciating the impact of lifestyle and environment as we grow up?
No, it's a combination. So in psychiatry, we talk about the biopsychosocial model of mental illness, and that is to say biology plays a part. So does our psychology and how we're feeling, and that can be influenced by our environment, and stress in particular is one of those phenomenons, if I can put it that way, that has a huge impact on how our mental health evolves. So stress as a biological phenomenon can restructure our brain. So it restructures synaptic connections, and that is to say that it breaks them. It can cause neurons to die in a very selective way in very specific brain areas. If you're already at risk from a, say, genetic perspective, you then find yourself in a situation of increased stress. So you lose you lose a few connections here and there. And then you find yourself from an environmental perspective, subjected to a trauma, for example. All of that is cumulative. And so you get past a particular point, you lose enough synapses, you lose enough neurons, and you spiral into a very deep mental health crisis. It's very clear, very predictable. You can see it.
And so is it the case then, if it's just genetics but everything else is sorted, you're much less likely to be impacted? Or if you don't have any genetic history but you're dealing with an enormous amount of stress, and I imagine from when you say stress, it is unprecedented stress, or because there's a lot of people have stressful jobs, but if they're used to it and if it's controlled and it's consistent, then at least you've got the requisite tools to manage that. But if it's new, like unexpected stress, and then if it is you're impacted by trauma, environmental trauma, then that's going to play a big part in it as well. But is it a combination of all three, two, sometimes one if it's severe, or is it consistency, I guess, about you've got to have one over the other?
You mentioned the type of stress, and that's a really important point, Richard. We call it uncontrollable stress.
Okay.
Uncontrollable stress. So the literature and the scientific community is very clear about this type of stress. So if you take, for example, a
This
mouse.
type of stress, sorry, Jim, that connects with mental health issues.
That's right. Well, stress essentially has an impact on brain structure. We know that. Now, the type of stress, the severity of stress, the amount of stress, that all has a bearing on things. So, for example, if you've got some low-level stress but it's ongoing, it can be cumulative. Or if you have just one big stressor but it's big enough, it can also have an impact. At the end of the day, stress reorganises our brain. It reorganises synapses, it reorganises, and it basically can kill off brain cells. Now, once you reach a particular threshold, losing synapses, losing brain cells is going to cause the emergence of mental health symptoms. There's no doubt about it. Now, one of the most, if I can put it this way, toxic stressors that we've got is what we call uncontrollable stress, stress that we have no way of controlling. And it gets back to a point that you just made again previously, Richard, and that is lifestyle. Now, modifiable lifestyle factors are, I guess, one of the greatest defenses that we've got against stress. Absolutely. Exercise. Big, we see exercise as having up to 40%. You can have a 40% improvement in terms of your mental health just by exercise. Sleep is another, nutrition is another. And the fourth one, which is gaining more and more traction, is what we call either brain training, and meditation falls into that brain training space. In other words, looking after our brain, and just like you relax at home after, you've had a tough day, either at, on the footy field or, gardening or whatever you do, right? You sit back and you relax. The brain is exactly the same. We go through an entire week of, high-level meetings and stressful scenarios playing out, and us sitting back and putting the brain into a brain space where it can actually relax and rejuvenate is very, very important. So those four lifestyle factors, so sleep, exercise, nutrition, and that brain training meditation space, can be double and sometimes 3 times more effective than the pills.
Wow, incredible. I feel like if I'm that person suffering from mental health, that is a huge barrier to look after myself. Like, I'm already there. I can appreciate, if we're all in a good place, we can exercise, eat well, and meditate and sleep. But if you are in the well, if you're in the hole, to be told you need to sleep better or you need to exercise is probably the least thing that I want to do. How do you get the patients to that place?
Once you're at a point where you are experiencing severe symptoms, lifestyle modification by itself is not enough. It's something that you have to have in addition to a treatment, whatever that treatment is. So regardless of whether you have the mainstay treatment, the stuff that doesn't work very well, which is the SSRI medication, or you have the new generation of treatments such as the ketamine or the brain stimulation interventions that work a lot better, you still have to do the lifestyle changes. And we know that if you modify your lifestyle in conjunction with those treatments, you get a better result. Now, your question about why doesn't lifestyle changes work when you've spiraled past a point, there is such a thing as a point of no return. In other words, you can lose enough synapses and you can lose enough neurons in your brain, which now you're starting to see the effects of mental ill health. And unless you start regenerating those synapses and those neurons, you're not going to see discernible improvements no matter how much you sleep, how much you exercise, and whether you start eating well. you really need an intervention that kickstarts your brain and puts it back on the right path. And at the same time, then you bring in the lifestyle changes.
It's funny because it's a paradox, because I guess the human societal norm is you've had a really stressful week. It's Friday. I want to go eat some junk food. I'm going to stay up late. I want to watch something that's not putting my brain at rest. And it's going to impact and I'm going to have less sleep. Why do you think, what's causing that polarity between what we should be doing as against what we are doing?
I think it comes down to everything in moderation, Richard. I mean, if you got to Friday and you're unwinding, with a drink, a video, and some junk food, I think that's completely fine. But if you're using those as coping mechanisms 5, 6, and 7 days per week, because you go home absolutely wrecked on a Monday, on a Tuesday, Wednesday, etc., and that's the way you cope, that's a slippery slope. That's a slippery slope. It's all in moderation, decompressing, if you like, or de-stressing because, you're sitting in front of a TV or you're eating some junk food once or so, once every so often, is not a bad thing. In fact, you could say that there is a level of neuroprotectiveness associated with that because, you're de-stressing. But just like bad habits, I mean, if you continue to do them and they become the norm, and they become habit, you're going to see the ill effects of that, no doubt about it.
Hey team, just popping in to say thanks for listening. If you're enjoying the episode, please take a second to like or follow the show and share it with a friend. It's the best way to help us grow and keep bringing you more great content. All right, let's get back into it. Dr. Jim, you moved from Sydney to the Sunshine Coast, and I want to hear about that journey when you started here and how that has brought you to the Thompson Brain and Mind Healthcare.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. It's an interesting story in that I was quite comfortable as a professor down at Sydney. I was working at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney there, where I was leading the brain imaging platform. An opportunity came up here on the Sunshine Coast. I'd never been to the Sunshine Coast before in my life, and I was told by a colleague that there was a small university called the University of the Sunshine Coast. They were establishing a new brain institute on the back of an incredible philanthropic donation by the Thompson family. I didn't know the Thompson family at the time, mind you, as well. I was invited up, and it was an opportunity that I thought was too good to knock back. Now, of course, at the time when I was telling and confiding in colleagues that I might be moving away from Sydney, which is, let's face it, one of the top universities on the planet, to a little regional university, which is not quite, on that stage, they thought I was crazy. And in fact, when I told people that I was going to USC, some of my colleagues in America said, "Oh, Jim, you're coming back home. You're coming to the University of Southern California," which is USC in America. And I've got very good colleagues and collaborators there. And I said, no, I'm not coming to University of Southern California. I'm actually going to the University of the Sunshine Coast. And most people thought I was mad. Most people thought I would burn my career by leaving the University of Sydney, where I was very, very successful. And I had a very good team to start up something that was a big risk. And so I came up and I thought it was a great opportunity to do the research that, for the most part, you can't do in a big university. Big universities sometimes can be risk averse. Working in a big city centre can sometimes be very crowded in terms of being able to run trials and studies, and it gets lost in the noise, essentially. So I thought about it, and I came up to the Sunshine Coast. It had a population of about 300,000, or 250 or 280,000 at the time. It was big enough but small enough at the same time, if that makes sense. And some of the areas that I really wanted, some of the projects that I really wanted to tackle, one of them was suicide prevention, seeing whether we could establish a suicide prevention program, roll it out into a community of about 300,000 people and see whether it could have an impact. Now, at the time when I came up, looking at the statistics, the Sunshine Coast, for whatever reason, had very bad mental health statistics, had a higher than the national average rate of suicide, had a higher than the national average child mental health issues. And so both of those areas are areas that I was had a very high PTSD issue as well. And all of those areas were areas that I worked very closely in, and I wanted to roll out programs and see how how they would fare up here. The suicide prevention program we rolled out a program, a very successful program with colleagues called the Alliance, and within 3 or 4 years, we saw a drop of about 10% in the rate of suicide above what the rate was here on the Sunshine Coast.
Yeah, right.
We established the first post-traumatic stress disorder PTSD institute here in Australia, and that, by all accounts, is going from strength to strength over at the Thompson Institute. We established and ran the most sophisticated youth mental health, longitudinal youth mental health program ever conducted anywhere in the world. And a very good colleague and I'm proud to say friend of mine, Professor Daniel Hermans, ran that for about 6 years. And it acquired, it's got one of the richest longitudinal data sets looking at the neurodevelopmental trajectory in adolescence anywhere in the world. So we can see how an adolescent brain develops during this adolescent period when they go to high school, for example, and see what goes awry, because we know a certain amount of those are going to crash during adolescence with a very significant mental health episode. And so that was an incredible opportunity to run that. You couldn't have run that anywhere else, I reckon. And here on the Sunshine Coast, it was embraced. And
because of the size of the community?
Because of the size of the community, yes. But also, if you look at a city centre like Sydney, you've got multiple big universities. It's very difficult to get the message out. Everyone's running great studies, whereas up here, the only university, it was really embraced by the community. And it's important to note that all of those programs, be it the PTSD, the suicide prevention, or the youth mental health program, they were all community programs. It really was about engaging the community and getting them on board and offering them something. And they've gone from strength to strength, just to highlight how successful those programs were, Richard. When I came up to the Sunshine Coast, there is this metric that the Australian government has, which they call ERA, or Excellence in Research for Australia. And the government, or the Australian Research Council, grades universities and certain programs or research clusters that they run based on, the quality of the research that they do. And in 2 years of being up on the Sunshine Coast, we got a ERA ranking of 5, which was the highest you could get, which essentially says that the work that you're conducting is well above world standards. A 5 is well above world standards. Now, the irony of that is, after I left Sydney University in neuroscience, Sydney University dropped from a 5 to a 4, and many of my colleagues have never let me live that down. But that highlights just how successful those programs were.
The offshoot from the Thompson Institute to the Brain and Mind Hub?
It's as we discussed a little bit earlier at the beginning of this podcast, Richard, the wheels of translation of research discovery, even the most promising research discoveries, they take a long time before they become, clinical services. And that's always frustrated me. And what I've come to know, having been in this game of research and clinical services for 30 plus years, is that universities are not good places to develop clinical services. They're not designed to do that. They do research, they teach students, but translating discoveries into a service is not what they do. They've got different risk appetite profiles. They're not geared up. They don't have the mechanisms and the frameworks in place. Likewise, hospitals are not great places to do research. Hospitals are where doctors work and they make sick people better. And I know that hospitals, and there's some great clinician researchers that do research in hospitals, but they're just not designed to do that. Research is expensive. It takes time. And no doctor has, the type of funding you need to make, life, groundbreaking, research discoveries. That's the exception rather than the rule. So universities are not good health places, and hospitals are not good research places. There has to be something in between. And that's where Thompson Brain and Mind Healthcare fits in. We've got development application approval for a 10,000 plus square metre innovation hub. It will be the first of its kind in Australia. It will include a specialised mental health hospital that rolls out some of the most recent discoveries. Some of these discoveries you won't see in a hospital for 10 plus years. But it'll also do research. It will also do teaching. So we will do research because we can do research. We're very good at doing research. It will teach the next generation of specialists, psychiatrists, for example, that the diagnosis and treatment of patients with mental ill health are not necessarily what they learned back in university. There are new ways to do it. We will also teach and generate a new workforce in neuroscientists and brain specialists. So that's where Thompson Brain and Mind Healthcare comes into it. It will be a hospital, treats patients. It will also be a research institute. It will do cutting-edge research. And all of this, Richard, is only possible through the amazing philanthropy of the Thompson family. So Roy and Nola Thompson, and very few people know this, have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into mental health research. And they are now supporting this next initiative. They were instrumental in identifying and for us to purchase the block of land that we have, which is in the health precinct. And it's very important to be there. We could have bought a block of land that was a fraction of the price. But if you look at these initiatives right around the world, be it Harvard and MIT in Boston or anywhere else, these private initiatives that we are setting up only work, or they work best when they're right in the heart of a health precinct, and that's exactly where we are. And the Thompsons were instrumental in identifying that. The Thompsons have also poured in more than $50 million into this building. This building, which will, when it's constructed, will be over $100 million building, be the only one of its kind, this innovation hub in Australia, and will look at technology and treatments that at the moment here in Australia don't exist. So things such as brain implants. Very few people understand or know that we can use little robotic devices, little implantable brain stimulators that go into very specific parts of your brain that can modulate activity, that can modulate brain function very, very selectively. And you can get incredible outcomes, all without the side effects. So implantable brain technologies are one of the areas that we're very interested in. We're also very interested in drug therapy as well, and we're trialling psychedelic therapies. We're the only group in Queensland that is doing a psilocybin trial for major depressive disorder. We've got a few other clinical trials, psychedelic clinical trials coming up as well. Again, only Queensland site, one of only, I think, 3 sites in Australia and one of only 8 sites around the world.
Wow.
We're also very interested in brain stimulation technologies.
Yeah, talk to me about this.
Well, yeah, brain stimulation technologies, and for example, ECT has a very bad public reputation. People have watched, Hollywood movies that have demonized brain stimulation, but the reality is brain stimulation is one of the most effective treatments that we've got to treat some of the most severe mental health conditions. So that's ECT, but we predominantly use a brain stimulation technology called TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it uses magnetic pulses to restore brain function. So remember when we talked about once you've kind of, spiraled into, for example, a very deep depression, no amount of lifestyle modification is going to get you out of that because you've lost synapses, you've lost neurons, etc. Brain stimulation can reverse a lot of that. What we see in those instances is that very specific parts of the brain are underactive because, not surprisingly, you've lost synapses, connections, and neurons.
They're not being used.
That's right. And you can use brain stimulation to bring those back up, for those neurons to start firing or normalise in the way that they're firing. Now, TMS has been around for about 30 years, and I was very lucky to be as a very junior researcher, I was very lucky to be part of a clinical trial that was being run at the Black Dog Institute in New South Wales in the early 2000s. And back then, the trial wasn't very successful. I think it was a negative trial at the time, but of course we knew fundamentally that brain stimulation worked. Now, this technology has evolved over time, and now it's an incredible treatment option. And there are constant advances as we better understand how to use the technology. So, for example, only in the last 2 or 3 years, we've discovered new modalities, new ways to use the technology. And we've seen a very dramatic increase in the remission rate of people with treatment-resistant depression. So treatment-resistant depression is when a person has trialled 3 or more antidepressants and have not got better. And in other words, when you've trialled 3 different classes of drugs, a doctor will maybe say, well, look, you know what, we've done everything we can. You are now resistant. You're treatment resistant. And this essentially almost thrown on a scrap heap. There's nothing else we can do. Now, TMS, what we've seen is standard TMS can have almost a double. You could almost get 40% remission rate with standard TMS.
Yeah, right.
And we've been working at developing these new accelerated protocols where you give a very concentrated form of brain stimulation over a very short period of time. And that 40% remission rate that people are seeing with TMS jumps up to 92% remission rate. So people who previously have tried every medication under the sun that have had no response can have these accelerated brain stimulation protocols that we run here in Maroochydore. I think we're the only group in Australia that are running them.
Yeah.
They can get up to 90% remission. Wow. They're very, very powerful protocols.
That's so impressive. You said at the start, I think it was before we started recording, but this last year you've had from a handful of staff to over 60 now. What have you learnt through that period of growth?
Lots. When I was at the Thomson Institute and the university, we had many more than 60 staff. But of course, you work within a big university, and of course, you've got different departments that provide support. But when you go off on your own, and after I left the university, I basically started up Thomson Brain and Mind Healthcare from scratch. We had no HR department. We had no finance department. You were basically doing everything from emptying the bins at the end of the day to seeing the patients during the day. And what I've learned is just how much lots of people do. The importance of having expertise, some of the greatest minds rubbing shoulders and working alongside you. It's not one person that runs and creates these things. It's, incredible people that, come along with you in this journey. And I've been incredibly fortunate to have people who have followed me from Victoria to come up here to study do a PhD, and now they're clinicians. I've had people, from interstate, from overseas that have come along, and they contribute in an amazing way. And we wouldn't be where we are creating new protocols and new treatments that are helping lots and lots of people if it weren't for all these people. The importance of collaboration, the importance of good colleagues that are committed to the cause. Very, very important.
Love that. It sounds really promising where you guys are headed, particularly with the infrastructure investment from the Thompsons here on the Sunshine Coast. What is utopia? If you could wave a wand, and what's the end goal, do you think?
Well, I'd like to see psychiatry move out of that traditional approach and look at a brain-based approach to treating mental ill health. If you look at the number of people across the planet that suffer from mental illness, and in 2026, which is only next year, mental ill health, and in particular depression, will overtake heart disease as the greatest or the biggest global health burden. Now, that is in part for two reasons. Number one, we're getting better at treating heart disease,
Yeah, sure.
right?
Yep.
And it's going down. And number two, we haven't really, up until now, had major advances in the way that we're treating mental ill health.
You're the same for decades.
Yeah, exactly. We've just been doing the same old thing, for years and years. So moving forward, I'd like to see this brain-based approach to mental ill health. So let's just do away with, mental ill health, the stigma associated, etc. It's just like any other medical condition. You take yourself, you get a brain scan, you get, a blood test. We look at that in very sophisticated ways, and we can pinpoint exactly the treatment in a very personalised way that will help you. So that is to say, moving away from population average type of statistics. In other words, take this because the majority of people that will take it might get better, and rather creating individualised treatments for John and Mary and Bob and Kathy, etc.
Dr. Jim, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise and knowledge on this. It's really impressive and biased, and because it's all happening on the Sunshine Coast. But yeah, amazing. Before you go, 5 quick questions for you. I haven't prepped you that, so I wish you all the best. What does success mean to you?
Mental health no longer being on the centre stage of, so many people suffering from mental health. So success for me is people, not talking about mental ill health like they are today.
What does happiness mean to you?
Happiness, family, climbing mountains, relaxing with family and friends.
What does a normal morning routine look like?
Up at around 4 or 5 o'clock, in the office by about 6 or 7 o'clock, returning emails, reviewing patient charts, speaking to patients, getting the team ready for the day.
Like that. If there's one piece of advice you'd give to your younger self that you could put on a billboard for the world to see, what would that be?
Trust your instinct. I've made a lot of decisions based on instinct, and it's always, held me in good stead.
Any times when you haven't, and it's proven that to be the case?
Oh, I'm sure, Richard. There has been, but none that stick out at the moment. No.
Yeah. Finally, Dr. Jim, someone that that you think would be a wonderful guest to come onto the show.
Depends if you want someone in the brain space or if you want someone outside of the brain space. I'm very biased. I think a lot of my colleagues are amazing people that kind of just work, they go under the radar. People just don't know how incredible they are. So I'd love to be able to put forward a couple of my colleagues.
Okay. Any in particular you want to shout out?
2 in particular, Dr. Megan Dutton, Professor Adam Can. Adam is a psychiatrist, but looks at psychiatric illness in a very, very different way. Dr. Megan is a mental health nurse practitioner. Both of them did PhDs with me, and they essentially shifted their views from the traditional way that they see psychiatry to a more objective way, and they've got incredible. They're seeing incredible outcomes with their patients.
Wonderful. Dr. Jim, thank you so much for coming on, mate.
Richard, thanks very much.
That was another episode of the Success Times Happiness podcast. Next time you're working to improve your mental health, turn to the person next to you and tell them all about the show. It really means a lot. A huge thank you to Dr. Jim for sharing his expertise, his honesty about where the mental health system must evolve. If today's conversation inspired you, please subscribe, leave a comment, or share it with someone who needs to hear it. It truly helps the show grow, and we really, really appreciate it. Until next time, peace.